welcome to another edition of Web of Faith 2.1.5. Of course, this is the special quarantine series that we're doing here at St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi in Flemington, New Jersey parish. It's based on our regular TV series, which you can see, Web of Faith 2.0, on EWTN, 11 o'clock Saturday nights, Eastern Standard Time. And I'd like to welcome my colleague, Father John Trujillo. And before that, we have sort of a Michael Bublé and Andrea Bocelli thing going on here. We're getting really high tech with our microphones so that the audio is a little bit better for you to hear. So hopefully that works. But Father Trujillo?
Yeah, I feel like we're news reporters at the National Convention.
Oh, yeah.
Remember those days when they would cover.
Right.
Yes,
and that would be the Republican convention, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
I'm from the Diocese of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and also Director of Pastoral Formation at Mount St. Mary Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland.
And we'd like to welcome all our viewers because now we're on YouTube, and so you're out of our parish, some of you, viewing this as far away as Canada.
Yeah.
So we really would like to welcome everyone to this. It's, again, a very informational session, and you can send in your questions. The email address will be put up shortly for anything theological, doctrinal, liturgical, spiritual, even canonical.
Agricultural.
Well, he is a chef, so yes, any cooking questions, you could send them to Father Trujillo. Yes,
Yeah.
right. But anyways, we would like to hear questions from you and answer your questions. It makes it a little bit more interesting, and I think a little fun on your part if we were able to answer them on this series. So without any further ado, let's start, Father Trujillo.
Okay.
Dear Father Trujillo, thank you so much for being here during quarantine. We really enjoy your homilies and your preaching style, and we look forward to seeing you once again in person when we can attend Mass again. My question is this: wasn't Martin Luther right in protesting the selling of indulgences? Signed, Marie.
Well, yes and no. Martin Luther was correct in that those who were purporting to sell indulgences were committing the sin of simony, because it's been, in fact, the word simony comes from the New Testament when Simon attempted to get ordained to become a bishop at the hands of St. Peter, and he wanted to pay money for it. And so his sin...
Was he Italian?
No. But
The Italians sometimes deal in the...
There's an old movie about Simon the Magician. If you ever get a chance to watch it, I think it's in color, but some big actors are in it. And anyway, he comes to a terrible end, but his name goes through history now as Simon is where we get the word simony. And there were some priests, now this was never endorsed by the church officially, there were some corrupt bishops and priests who were going around saying to people, look, you're so busy, you're a peasant, you're working in the fields and whatever, and you don't have time to pray for your loved ones who may be in purgatory. So we'll pray for them, for you, and in recompense, you give us a little, what we say, scarol in Italian.
A little busta.
A little busta. Well, that's selling spiritual things, and that's the sin of simony. Now, there were people who were donating money, who obviously had the money, and they donated it to the poor and to the building of churches. And if they were properly disposed, that's the key here. Just because they gave money didn't mean they automatically got an indulgence. You had to be free from all attachment of sin, even venial sin, to receive the plenary indulgence. So if you were a mobster, if you were a terrorist, if you were somebody who was evil and wicked and you did all kinds of bad things, you had a lot of mortal sins on your soul that were not forgiven, you could give all the money in the world, you wouldn't get one single grace as a consequence.
And a plenary indulgence can only be applied to yourself or to a faithful departed. It cannot be applied to another living soul.
Yes.
So, because it depends on that living soul's own state in life. So they have to do their own spiritual exercises themselves, and the attachment of sin and being freed from that, and etc.
So Luther was objecting to something legitimate in the sense that there were some priests, and like I said, some bishops, even some cardinals, who were being very bad in trying to, were committing the sin of simony. But there were a lot of priests and bishops who were doing it the right way, asking people if they could donate, especially to the fixing up of St. Peter's in Rome, but also money to go to the Holy Land to fix up the shrines, the places where Jesus was born, like in Bethlehem or the Holy Sepulchre. So Luther threw the baby out with the bathwater, in other words. And because he was also very scrupulous, he would miss his prayers as an Augustinian. Remember, he was a priest, a Catholic priest, before he left the church and started the Lutheranism. As a monk, he, in fact, even how he joined the monastery, he was deadly afraid of thunderstorms and lightning. And there was a terrible storm one day, and he made a promise to the Blessed Virgin Mary that if she spared his life, he'd join the monastery, which isn't the best reason. I mean, that's a formation issue right there.
Today, that would not be a reason to join,
Yeah,
and they
get
probably would
disqualified.
discern them right out if that came the case. Yes.
So he
Both
survived.
being working in seminary where we kind of
That would be a red flag right there.
Right.
So he survives. He joins the Augustinian monks, which was a bit strict. In fact, even stricter than most of the Benedictine orders. And as a consequence, he became very scrupulous. So he would miss his prayers for like 20 some days, 29 days, and then try to catch up on everything.
Yeah, he was scrupulous and lax at the same time. I think he
Back and forth.
between back and forth. He would really be a great candidate for psychotherapy, I think. Because if you look at his background and what he went through and all that, and then what happened to him after, and he was also used as a pawn, really, by German princes. And that's another question later on. But so he really is a poor thing in that.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, you feel bad for him, but he crossed the line because now when he put the 95 Theses on the door of the cathedral, okay, his 95 Theses, that was not revolutionary per se, because that was a typical way of announcing you're going to have a debate or a discussion, because there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there's no Snapchat. So that's how you broadcast, and you were going to have a discussion. But it was the fact that he was not going to entertain any possibility that he might be wrong. And so he went to the furthest extreme,
and I think that
broke from Rome.
Isn't that the sin of pride, right?
Absolutely.
Pride was
absolutely.
At the root of that. Yeah.
So yes, there were some who were selling indulgences, but that wasn't the reason to throw out the whole idea of indulgences.
Because just to interject here, remember, we've had reformers in the church all along. They were religious communities. For example, St. Francis of Assisi, he got his inspiration to find his community when the Lord spoke to him from the crucifix, the San Damiano, and said, rebuild my church. And it wasn't just rebuilding the physical building, but rather rebuild the church spiritually. And he did so through his religious order of the Franciscans. Dominic, similar, through the order of preachers, we know as Dominicans. So that's why we call the Protestant, not a Reformation, but we call it the Protestant revolt, because they did not reform the church within, but rather they broke away from the church. Now, the period, though, after in the Catholic Church, we call it the Counter-Reformation, and that's where the Sacred Council of Trent, we received the Catechism of Council of Trent and all sorts of reforms of the Missal and etc. So the church realized that it did need to clean its act in certain areas up, especially in priestly formation, because a lot of the problems were ignorant clergy, and it addressed it in the Council of Trent. That's where you'd go, that's how you work in the church and to reform. But what Martin Luther did was the opposite. He broke,
yes.
That's why we call it the Protestant revolt.
And I think that leads us right in, Father Ken, beautifully segue into our next question, which is for you. Dear Father Briganti, really like the show. Love all three of you, and your masses, your church are beautiful. My question is, what caused the Reformation? And this is from Martin. Not Martin Luther, but whoever Martin out there.
Well, Martin, politics had a big play in it. A lot of the German princes were envious over church property and church land, especially monasteries. Monasteries were not just buildings, but rather they could encompass towns. So they were almost like a little fiefdom or a city-state. And so these German princes thought, hey, we can confiscate this in the name of Reformation. and take all the property money and put it in our own war chest and build up our own, so to speak, empire. So a lot of it had to do, they used religion as the subterfuge, but when it came down to it, it was politics.
Oh, yes. And it's the same as in England. Both in England and in Germany, you had this idea that, well, if we're under the authority of Rome, the Pope, and the Pope is the one who crowns the Holy Roman Emperor, that meant all the princes and all the other kings were subservient to the emperor and to the Pope, because he could depose you, he could excommunicate you.
Put your country under
Interdict.
which means no sacraments could
So
be
here
celebrated.
you've got Martin Luther, who gives them an opportunity. If he breaks from the religious structure, that allows them to break from the political structure. So if Martin Luther breaks from the Pope, then the princes can break from the Holy Roman Emperor. And that was basically what really pushed the Reformation to its highest degree in Germany. And you also had the rise of the middle class. You had the merchants, the guilds. You had this sort of this desire to amass power and land, as Father Briganti said. The church had a lot of property, but that property was used not just for the monastery, but the people in the area would, they were tenant farmers, they would take care of it. And if the barbarians or somebody came to sack the place, the monks let them come in within the walls of the monastery. So it was a nice relationship.
And also in time of plague too.
Yes.
They would retreat into the monasteries for medicine, being cared for. So it was really more than just owning property and owning, although that could also, there was abuse in that as well, called the prince archbishops. They were archbishops, meaning heads of archdioceses, but they were also, because it comes from the medieval times of lords and dukes and duchesses, they are also, some of them were princes. So like in Würzburg, Germany, there was the prince archbishop. And I had it when I went to Germany, and it's in Bavaria. I actually toured the palace of the Prince Archbishop. Now, the Prince Archbishop is not allowed to get married, so it is whoever becomes the next Archbishop of Würzburg will then become the Prince of also. So he ruled in land and in spirituality. So that was an abuse, of course, that came in, and of course after. That Salzburg was another one of those fiefdoms as well, and that was something that was corrected after that, so that it became more of a spiritual ruling instead of a physical property ruling. But if you remember the time, papal states were also there too. So the Pope also not only was the spiritual leader of the church, but also he was a physical ruler of the papal states, and that was supposed to secure his independence from the Holy Roman Emperor and etc.
And the Reformation also occurred, as we would say, at the perfect storm, because you had political intrigue, you had economic
technology
powers, you had also the spiritual and theological. But also remember this, the Black Plague, all right, we're talking about the coronavirus now. The bubonic plague, all right, got rid of 1/3 of Europe, of the people, but 2/3 of the clergy. And so they were so desperate for priests to be able to celebrate the sacraments, they ordained any man who was breathing. No seminary foundation. Seminaries were founded by Trent after the Reformation. So that's why Martin Luther was concerned, rightly so, that you had some very poorly educated clergy. They didn't have any place to go to school, and the church was desperate just for somebody to be able to celebrate the sacraments. So you had all this sort of mediocre to poor clergy, economic problems, political, and then of course you had Martin Luther with his theological problems. So all of that made it the perfect storm.
It was Pope St. Pius V that with Council of Trent. It was St. Robert Bellarmine with the Catechism, working on
Charles Borromeo.
And Charles Borromeo for seminaries. Because there was no seminaries as we know today, the seminaries that we know today, and then the standard form of the liturgy, the Roman liturgy, was finally standardized because each country had a little bit of a variation of it, and with the Council of Trent came the standard form. A lot of countries, though, came late to the Roman liturgy, though, even after the standard form. France was one of them that held out with the Gallican Rite. And it was only after the French Revolution, in the restoration of the Catholic Church, through the abbot Gouranger, I think, that was able to bring the Roman liturgy finally and that's in the 19th century, by the way, into France. So, but that was the reason why there was standard, is because to send out all abuses that were creeping into the liturgy.
Yeah, you had a lot of work that had to be done. And going back a little bit further in church history, given more context too, besides the bubonic plague that wiped out 2/3 of the clergy, we also had the problem of the popes being in Avignon, France for 70 years. It was known as the Babylonian captivity. Finally, Pope Gregory moved back to Rome because St. Count of Siena went from
Inspired
Rome
him.
and said to him, hey, go back to where you belong in Rome. You're the bishop of Rome and the pope. Those 70 years of having the popes not live in Rome because it was a dangerous place, living in France, he had a lot of French cardinals who kept electing other French cardinals as pope. But then when the pope moved back to Rome, the French cardinals wanted to make sure that they could go back to their livelihood in France. And the
Anti-popes.
we had occasion we had three claimants to the papacy. So you got confusion. Even some of the saints were back in different guys.
So you had the central power of the church was weak.
It was chaos.
Yes.
So you had Rome, Pisa, and Avignon. And after that ended, you had the period of the Renaissance popes who were very decadent, the Borgias, the Medicis. So again, this all added to the perfect storm. Not that Luther was right in breaking away, but there was a lot of stuff on the plate that needed to be addressed, and he went to the extreme of throwing the whole plate out as opposed to cleaning it up.
The only good thing that came out of the Babylonian captivity, Father John, Chateauneuf
To pop.
the wine of the popes from
The wine that's
Avignon,
in
France.
Avignon, yes.
Otherwise, it was a complete disaster. Yeah, because the popes were also rulers of the papal states, so there was lawlessness within the papal states, and they were the ones that helped not only keep law and order, but civility and the structure of the cities and things like that were decayed beyond belief. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the Pope moved from St. John Lateran, which was the original headquarters of the church, to St. Peter's Basilica, because the walls of the Vatican kept the Pope safe, because that's how lawlessness crept in. So there was a lot of problems at the time. So we think we have problems today. It doesn't compare to the time.
No.
And then the English Reformation was, of course, we know Henry VIII had an insatiable appetite, not just with food, but he had many
Six
wives.
wives. Six wives.
And he was trying to say that his first wife, because he could not give him an heir to the
male heir
to the
throne.
to the throne, that he wanted to have an annulment. An annulment meant that the Catholic marriage was invalid, and of course, Rome said that the marriage was valid, and that infuriated Henry. And then Henry pillaged the church at that moment, the monasteries, and destroyed Catholic anything that had to do with Catholicism went right out the window. And his daughter, Elizabeth, who became Elizabeth I, finished the Protestant Reformation by solidifying the liturgy in what we call the Book of Common Prayer. And it wasn't really until the 19th century under Newman, who eventually became a Catholic, that there was what they called the Oxford movement that brought back some forms of sacramental objects back into the liturgy of the Anglican Church. Otherwise, it was pretty low liturgy at that time, almost evangelical, really. And then the Oxford movement made it more of a Catholic looking, so which is what they have a hybrid sort of today. But that all had a fuel through politics as well.
And
And
you
could
see
just
the
go through
Reformation
every country
had a
that
great-
went through there, you could see politics behind it all.
Yeah. So although it was very disruptive, God permits these things, so greater good could come from that.
Martin, thank you for a great question. Dear Father Trujillo, I have a question for you. Do parish priests take a vow of poverty? If not, why not? And do bishops? Well, you might not have taken it, but you just got a cut in pay because
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the university where you're at. So
Yeah, we got a salary cut.
Yeah.
Well, we used to say among the diocesan priests, and it's a tongue in cheek, so don't take it too literally. But we used to say that the religious take the vow of poverty and we live it. But in reality, the religious priests, I'm talking about like the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, the Benedictines, and so forth. They take the three evangelical counsels: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Now, by them taking the vow of poverty, legally speaking, they own nothing. They don't have a credit card. They don't have
they don't have to pay
checking
taxes
account.
to
They
the
don't pay taxes.
government.
But the order provides for all of their needs. They might get maybe $50 or $100 of PIN money if they need something during the month, but everything's paid for. And even when they don't even have to fill out income tax because of that vow of poverty. Now, we are diocesan priests, Father Briganti, myself, Father Marinelli, and although we don't take the vow of poverty, we are asked to live a life of poor in sense of detachment from things. We have our own cars. We pay for those cars. We
pay
buy the
taxes.
gasoline. We some dioceses pay for insurance. Other places like mine, you got to pay for your own. Now we have to use the things that we own in the same way that the lay people do. We're not to accumulate things and not be concerned with people who are less off than we are. We're paid a very modest salary. But like I said, we have to, we have a room and board that's provided by the parish. But other things like, when one of our siblings or parents get ill, guess what? The diocese isn't going to pay for anything. You have to take out of your own funds, provide for that. You have to have your own pension. There's a lot of things that we do that is provided through our own means. It's not lavish, however, and it's just enough for us to get by. The bishops, they receive a salary as well. But in comparison to our Protestant counterparts, the Protestant ministers, the Protestant bishops or leaders that they have in their community, they're paid a lot more, one, because they have wives and families, but also because of the structure. So they'll give them a big salary, like $80,000, so they can purchase a home and provide for their family. And obviously, they also have to pay much more in taxes. A Catholic priest would make a lot less than that, maybe half of what our counterparts make.
But a home is provided for us. That's
Yes.
called a rectory. There is a food allowance that's provided for us, etc. So a lot of our needs are taken care of by the parish, and so our salaries don't have to be as large as that as
And
well.
we live a life
And we
of
don't
simplicity.
have wives and children and etc. as well. But the common rule about that is that we don't supposed to live above the means of our people, and so that's why our salaries are just to keep us what we need, but not to live a lavish lifestyle. That being said, we also live celibacy, right? Because we have to promise that to the bishop. And celibacy, just like marriage and single person, involves the virtue of chastity. Okay, chastity helps us be a good celibate. Chastity helps a good married couple be faithful, right? And chastity helps a single person also be faithful to their commitment. So we do make the promise of celibacy, which includes the virtue of chastity, and then finally the other vow, obedience. We do take upon the ordination and diaconate. We make obedience to our bishop and his successors. So in that way we do. So we sort of we do live those three evangelical principles, but formally. Especially in the areas of poverty, we don't take the vow of poverty, so we can inherit something from our families and etc. and do that. But we're not supposed to live a lavish lifestyle or above the means of our people.
No. Now we do have to buy our own clothes. If you were religious, your order would pay for your habit. We have to buy our own cassock, our own shirts, pants, socks, shoes. We go to the barber. You go to the dentist, the co-payments.
We do go
come
out to
of our
dinner
pocket.
when it's not quarantine. We do go out to dinner, so that's perfectly acceptable. But it's the lifestyle of the
Yes.
rich and famous that we shouldn't be living,
Yeah.
because we should be a countercultural. That's why a priest wears black, because we're supposed to be countercultural to the world. So anyways, that was a very good question. I
Yeah,
think
that covered quite a bit there.
maybe time for one more, Father.
Okay, this is for you.
Okay.
Dear Father Ken, wonderful job. Why are priests celibate when married clergy coexisted from antiquity? Wasn't St. Peter married? His mother-in-law was healed by Jesus, was he not?
This is true. But St. Peter left everything all behind to follow the Lord, okay? Because as we see
He left the wife behind.
to,
No, it's presumed that she wasn't a living.
she wasn't living yet, but he left the fishing.
He left the mother-in-law back behind.
Yeah, he left his fishing business behind. He left his lifestyle. No, his right. He was married, but it is presumed that his wife had passed on. But also known that some of the clergy in time did marry, and it wasn't really until
The Council of Elvira in 306 that made it normative, and then it became mandatory in the 11th century for the Western Church.
right. And the Eastern Church priests can still get married, and the Byzantine Catholics, so to speak, because that's their tradition. But the reason why to be called to a Latin Rite priesthood, it's a double vocation. Okay, it is the vocation to celibacy and the vocation to holy orders. And if you don't have one, then you can't have the other. So so a priest has to be called to both. And there's enough formation in a priest's life, 8 years, that when one goes to become ordained a deacon, is able to make that commitment and knows what that commitment entails. That doesn't mean that we are consecrated refrigerators, cold or anything. We're supposed to be spiritual fathers to our parish family. So in that way, it's life-giving and regenerate. We bring children into life through baptism. We feed our children through the sacrament of Holy Communion, okay, through the Mass. We heal. We bring healing things to them through the sacrament of anointing and the sacrament of penance. So in a very real way, our spiritual family, our parish, are our family, and we are their spiritual father. So even though we're not married per se in the church, the church becomes sort of our family in that respect. So St. Peter's mother-in-law, he still was concerned about her. He didn't abandon her or anything. That's why our blessed Lord healed him. But from then on, he was living pretty much. He didn't remarry. Okay, he lived a celibate life with the virtue of chastity to carry on the mission of that our blessed Lord entrusts him to be the vicar of Christ.
Because it would have been, had his wife been still alive, it would have been unjust and uncharitable for him to abandon her, because there'd been no way for her to sustain herself. So it's presumed, this is pious tradition, it's not dogma, that his wife passed away. Now, we do have an instance where a few priests in your diocese, in my diocese, we have a couple priests who are married because they converted to the Catholic faith. And even in the Orthodox religion, there's the practice that if they're married clergy, have to be married before they're ordained. You can't get married if you're ordained as a single person. And so when we have a Protestant, like I have a gentleman in my diocese who's going to become a Catholic priest. He was married. He was an Episcopalian priest, a chaplain in the army, and now he's going to become God willing, a Roman Catholic priest. He'll be ordained as a married man because he brought his wife with him into the faith. And there are exceptions. There's a special indult from the Holy Father that extends to them a special provision. But even with that, they're typically not made a pastor, because in a parish, you're working full-time 24 hours a day, and the rectory is not really set up to have a wife and children. You know, it's set up either for one priest or maybe a couple of priests, but not a whole family. And so in many cases when you have a married clergy in the Catholic Church, they might have a different assignment. They might be chaplains or a parochial vicar somewhere, but typically not as a pastor, only because of the economic aspects.
Well, hopefully this discussion can go on because there's such a rich question, but hopefully that answered your question today. So we come to a conclusion in another episode of our series of Web of Faith 2.10 or in a half, 2.1 and a half. And we like to thank you for tuning in, and also thank you for your generosity and bringing in your contributions to the church. either by mailing them in or leaving them at the parish center Monday through Friday between 10 and 1, or in the church basket that we keep since we have adoration going on all day, or electronic giving, or texting, and now even PayPal. That's really the best way to do it, so that it ensures a steady income for the parish, since we need to continue to pay our electricity and gas and employees, so we need to continue move on. We need that steady income to help to do that. So we thank you for those who are continuing their charitable contributions to our parish. And now, as we come to a conclusion, Father, let's give them our blessing.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
God bless you until we see you next time.
Bye-bye.